Welcome to the Hangar Z podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts and partnered with Vertical Valor magazine. On today's episode, John Gray and Jack Schonely have an amazing conversation with an accomplished aviator and flight instructor. Tim Tucker has been flying helicopters for over 50 years. He has over 20,000 hours of helicopter flight time with 9,000 hours of instruction given. Tim began his flying career at Fort Rucker, Alabama, as a U.S. Army warrant officer. He was deployed to Vietnam, where he became a highly decorated pilot, including the Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Bronze Star, 28 Air Medals, 5 Certificates of Achievement, Senior and Master Army Aviator Wings, and the U.S. Army Broken Wing Award. Tim's accomplishments after returning to civilian life are many. His relationship with Robinson Helicopters and Frank Robinson himself had a powerful impact on the rotorcraft industry. Stay tuned and learn about Tim's high-risk missions into Laos, purchasing the very first Robinson R22, developing a safety course that would reduce accidents by 66%, and the thousands of check rides he completed as an FAA pilot examiner. Thank you to our sponsors, Airbus, Night Flight Concepts, Precision Aviation Group.
Welcome to the Hangar Z podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts. The Hangar Z podcast is the first and only podcast dedicated to promoting and exploring the personnel and equipment behind the missions in public safety aviation. Join your host, John Gray, Jeff Ratkovich, and Jack Schonely.
Still southbound, skidding to a stop. Stand by here. Looks like you're getting ready to bail. Heads up, guys, bailing. Okay, the guy, he's running through the house, jumping the fence, through the shotgun, through something out. Grabbing the shotgun. Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again. He is armed. Stay there. Hold your position.
4 on the stop. You're in custody.
Good advising code 4 on the stop.
Welcome to the Hangar Z podcast. I'm your host, Jack Schonely. With me today is the creator of the Hangar Z podcast, Mr. John Gray. John, how are you?
Hello, Jack. Good morning. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, talking to you on the heels of European rotors.
Yeah.
And, my body's still trying to catch back up to West Coast time.
You're still on Dutch time.
Yeah.
Well,
I've never
good.
traveled like that before, and people talk about jet lag.
Yeah.
And, I've been from the West Coast to the East Coast, of course, and I've never experienced this in this way. So
It's a whole different ball game.
It is, but it was a great experience, and really honored to be here with you and our guest.
Yes,
I've
this
heard
is exciting.
a lot about over the course of my career, and it's just an honor to be here with the two of you.
Well, this is exciting today. I've been anticipating this for a while. We kind of had to wait till our guest retired because he was a busy man. It would have been hard to do this. I'm sure he would agree. And he's still working, but I'm going to do a quick intro before we even talk about naming him, and just to grab our listeners and give you an understanding of what's to come here. Our guest today has 54 years of flying, over 21,000 hours of flight time, 9,000 of those hours as instructing as a CFI. He's a Vietnam vet. I have to read them because I don't want to miss something. I'll just go down the list real quick. Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Bronze Star, 28 Air Medals, 5 Certificates of Achievement, Senior and Master Army Aviator Wings, U.S. Army Broken Wing Award. That we could go here for an hour just going through the qualifications and the awards and accomplishments of our guests, but we have to kick into gear and let our guests tell us about all of this. So I would a warm welcome to Mr. Tim Tucker. Tim, welcome to the Hangar Z podcast.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
We're so excited. This is many of our listeners are going to go, oh, I know Tim. He did my private. He did my commercial. He did, yes. And we're going to get to all that because Tim did a lot of that. And we'll talk about those numbers in a bit. But before we get to all that, we'd like to learn a little bit more about our guests before they became aviators and before they became involved in in all sorts of other activities that involved helicopters and teaching and all these other things that you've done. So let's start at the beginning. Where'd you grow up at, Tim?
Okay, let's see. First, I was born in White Plains, New York, right outside of New York City. I spent most of my life, though, in Connecticut. Went to most of my schooling, high school in Connecticut, and then spent 4 years in college in northern Vermont, outside of Burlington, Vermont.
Nice. So you were a Northeast guy all the way, right, in the beginning.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I'm currently in Southern California.
I understand. I can relate to that. When did aviation pop up on the radar? Was there something as a kid or a teenager before you jumped in to aviation?
No, actually the exact opposite. I had never had any kind of interest in aviation at all. None. Zero. I mean, I wasn't one of these guys who worked out at the local airport washing airplanes to get flight time or nothing like that. I graduated from college in 1969, which was a pretty volatile time in the middle of the Vietnam War, a lot of protests going on. And my intention was to go on to law school. However, the draft, let me back up. When I was in undergraduate school in college, I had a deferment from the draft. However, once you graduated, the only way you could maintain that deferment is if you went into medicine, could be a doctor, or you went into teaching, going to be a teacher. But if you wanted to go on to get an MBA or go to law school or any of these other things, you were susceptible to the draft. And about 4 weeks after I graduated in the spring of '69, I got my notice to be drafted. So my whole direction changed. Here I'd been thinking I was going to go off to law school, and it changed towards the military. And I happened to be home from school. I was at a local pub that we all went to. And here I'd been gone for 4 years away at college. And I met a friend of mine who, when I graduated from high school, he went off to the Army and flew helicopters. And I went off to college. We just happened to meet back at this pub. And knowing that the Army was going to be a big part of my future, he just totally convinced me that if you have to go to Vietnam, go as a pilot.
Wow.
And so that began my road down this pilot thing that I had every intention of, once I completed Vietnam, going back to law school and continuing on that way. None of that ever happened.
Wow. I didn't see that coming, Tim. That's amazing that for someone who has all the experience that we're about to talk about, when people get done with this podcast, they're going to think back to this part of it and go, wow, he had no interest in aviation and he ends up being a huge influence in the aviation world.
To take that one step further, when you enlist in the Army or after you're drafted, you get, I don't know, a period of time, 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that, where you could choose to enlist. And when you choose to enlist, you can select whatever you want to do.
Right.
You can drive helicopters, or you can drive tanks, or you can be an air traffic controller, or you can choose just to be drafted, which is just a 2-year commitment. So because of this conversation with this friend of mine, I chose flying helicopters. But you have to take the tests for it before you can actually be accepted into the Army. And when I took the flight aptitude test, same test they still give today, I think you have to score a 70 on the test for them to let you in. I scored a 70 on the test.
Wow. Wow.
So I'm not one of these natural people at all.
Wow. So now you've joined the Army. Now, where did you go initially before you end up in flight training? Where did you go initially in the Army for your training?
Well, at that time, I was going to Warrant Officer Candidate School. So
Okay.
all warrant officer candidates went went to basic training in Fort Polk, Louisiana.
Fort Polk.
So
Okay.
even though they had basic training sites all over the country, if you're going to be going to flight school, which is in Texas, you all went to Fort Polk, Louisiana for your basic training.
Okay.
So that was my first Army experience.
Wow. And from there, you went to Texas. Where in Texas did you go?
Well, from there, the first 5 months of flight school is in Fort Walters, Texas, which is in Mineral Wells, Texas, just west of Fort Worth.
Okay.
And that's the first 5 months. Then the last 4 months, it's Fort Rucker, Alabama.
Yeah.
And then it was on to Vietnam.
Wow. So you ended up at UCLA, upper corner of lower Alabama. We've had numerous guests tell us about UCLA, and we're like, UCLA, the upper corner of lower Alabama. I love that so much. Tell us about your Fort Rucker experience.
Well, it really wasn't, there really isn't much to tell there. I mean, it was the end. By the time you got to Fort Rucker, they'd spent so much effort, time, money that you were going to complete it unless something, physically happened to you.
Yeah.
At the Fort Walters phase, there was a number of gates. And if you didn't meet those gates,
Yeah.
you were gone and they'd get somebody to replace you. But by the time you got to Fort Rucker, you pretty much knew you're going to be completing the program. And so it was more a refining of a pilot rather than a creation of a pilot.
Right. Was it natural for you? Did it come naturally, or was Fort Walters, was that challenging for you?
Well, I don't think it came naturally to me. It was hard. The Army was hard.
Yeah.
I was dealing from 4 years on a college campus in 1969 to having this person, yelling in your face at you constantly for 8 hours a day. So there's the big adjustment was the Army, not so much the learning to fly. That was the kind of thing I enjoyed it and worked at it. So the adjustment wasn't learning to fly. It was the Army. And interestingly, I ended up spending the next 27 years in the Army in some way, shape, or form.
John, I think you were looking to ask a question here. I saw it in your face. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was kind of along the lines of what you just brought up. I mean, you look at your long, distinguished flying career, and it's easy sometimes for us to forget the challenges we faced in the early days of our flying careers. You've seen a lot of students progress through their different certifications. You've seen the day one students compared to, later in their career. When you look and reflect on your early days, the first 1 or 2 days of your experience, and I think of mine, and I didn't think I was going to make it. It's really hard trying to hold a hover and those things. What do you remember as being challenging outside of what you described as the Army experience, but just the flying side of it? Because I think it's inspiring for our listeners to hear someone like yourself talk about some of those challenges, because everyone faces them. So I'm curious to see what some of your challenges were in the early days of your flying career.
Okay, I'm probably going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I think one of the things about learning to fly in the military is, for all intents and purposes, you spend all your waking hours, day in and day out, devoted to learning to fly. As opposed to the civilian world, where many times people are trying to work this learning to fly in with a job, a family, and all the things that life presents them. So I think it's a little easier from once you get past all the military stuff to be in a situation where your wife or your family is not around, and you can devote 100% of your efforts towards learning to fly. Now, having said that, here's where I'm going to kind of go off on a little tangent. A number of years ago, I went up to do a bunch of ATP rides in S-76s for a company that used the S-76 for offshore oil exploration or servicing the rigs, that type of thing. It's here in California. And the pilot, the hired pilots they had were half from the military and half from the civilian world. And I thought this was going to be very interesting to see this difference at the ATP level of giving the test to military trained and experienced pilots versus many of them that learned in R22s. And I think there's about 8 fellows that I give the test to, and I really saw no difference at all. In fact, I was really kind of amazed that, and I'm sure the company had a lot to do with it, but the two types of pilots had been able to integrate pretty well. There was no animosity on the part of the military people towards the civilian people or vice versa. They ran a 2-pilot operation, and in some instances where the civilian trained fellow was the PIC that day and the Army trained guy was the co-pilot, they worked together very well. They enjoyed each other. I was really quite impressed with the way. So I don't think it really matters. I think whether one takes a civilian route to their flying career or the military route.
Yeah, there's a ton of pathways to the pilot seat, which is really interesting because for me as a kid, I thought it was one way. I really thought it was just the military. If you didn't get into the military and start flying there, there's no other options for you. And now, of course, you realize down the road, there's hundreds of ways to get into it.
Well, I'm going to jump ahead of you here a little bit, John, and say it's because of the Robinson R22 that there is this civilian option.
Yep.
I think without that Robinson R22 back in the late 70s, early 80s, that option would have been closed to an awful lot of people.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Going back to, I guess, the root of the question, what did you see? What was flying wise? What was the biggest challenge for you as an early student? Was it holding a hover? Was it navigating? What was the thing that was really challenging for you?
Well, I learned in the Army's CH-55, which is equivalent to Hughes 269 A model. Now, the A model had a slightly shorter blade, smaller tail rotor, and all of our auto-rotation training, even pre-solo, was all to the ground. I don't think the only time we did a power recovery is if things were just going so bad you couldn't risk going to the ground. So here you have this low inertia, small helicopter, and all the auto-rotations were to the ground. So there's no question the auto-rotation was the most challenging part of the whole training. No question at all.
Yeah. Jack, did you see that with the training you had with your students, where that was an obstacle and something that was difficult to overcome?
Oh, sure. And like Tim was just describing, I was from an agency where everything was to the ground too, as Tim well knows. We did everything to the ground. The only time we even practiced power recovery autos was preparing to go see Tim, for a check ride with the FAA. It was all to the ground. Hovering, I think, tends to be the biggest obstacle that I saw. It was certainly for me. I worked hard at that, and I remember the first 5 to 10 hours, and my instructor just laughing, I guess it was so bad, and him trying to give me little techniques, and then one day it just clicked. It just clicked, and everybody told me that was going to happen, but it got frustrating. It's going, why can't I do this? I'm watching Bob Percy, who Tim knows. Bob was my primary instructor at the time. And he said, relax, just relax. It will come. It doesn't happen overnight. But at the same time, it does, because one day you're going to come in here, get in this cockpit, and you're going to do it and go, why couldn't I do that the last 15 hours? So that was the biggest thing for me.
I tell people there's an invisible button on the cyclic. You'll find it. It's just a matter of time. But once you find it and you push it, it's there.
Yeah.
The reason I go to the auto-rotation is because there's no invisible button on that auto-rotation.
No.
You're working on that the day before every check ride you'll ever take.
Yes.
It's true.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And do you think back to instructors that you had and go and say, wow, that's the type of instructor I wanted to be, and I think I was, and that's the kind of instructor I don't want to be? Did you have instructors that you kind of modeled yourself after?
When every second counts, Trust Night Flight Concepts to keep you mission ready. With advanced night vision technology, FAA certified repair services, and expert training, we've got your six. Visit nightflightconcepts.com to learn more.
It's interesting you said that because just this past summer at Oshkosh, when I got this award, it was an instructing award. And so the story I told as part of my acceptance talk was about the worst instructor that I ever had. And he just happened to be the very first instructor I ever had.
Wow.
So, and now, I've been around the world. I've had probably hundreds of different instructors, and I certainly have given tests to numerous instructors. So I find it curious that my worst instructor, the worst one I ever saw, was my first one.
Incredible. You got him out of the way. How long did you have him teaching you?
I had him until we did non-rotation and simulated engine failure. I pushed the wrong pedal, almost turned us upside down. He grabbed the controls, landed the helicopter, and he turns to me and he says, "Tucker, if you ever do that again, I'm going to break both your legs." He used a little stronger language, but so that was it. I went back to the flight commander and said, I want a new instructor. And the flight commander said, he says, "What's wrong, Tucker? Are you afraid of flying?" And I said, "No, I don't think I'm afraid of flying." Remember, I hadn't yet even soloed in the Army. And I said, "Well, are you afraid of the helicopter? Are you afraid of that?" I said, "No, I don't think I'm afraid of the helicopter." He said, "Well, what's the problem?" And I said, "I'm deathly afraid of my instructor." And so he went along with that. I got a new instructor and soloed and, went on without an issue. But
yes, that's funny. We talk about that regularly, how there's enough stress in learning to fly. You don't need an instructor that's threatening you or yelling at you or telling you that he's going to break your legs. Oh my gosh. I mean,
that's right. You can't scare somebody into learning to fly.
No, it won't work. It will not work. That's great. That's neat that it happened to be your first too.
We do talk about the principles of instruction a lot, and not just in the pilot seat as it pertains to the tactical flight officers and the observers too, because the same principles apply there. So sorry to hijack the conversation, but a question for you, Tim, of over the course of your career instructing and doing the things you've done, what have you found to be the most effective way or theory, I guess you could say, in training students? What typically has the most impact with folks?
I kind of go back to what Jack alluded to a moment ago, and it'll be slightly different with each student, but doing your best to get the student to relax. I think stress is probably the biggest inhibitor of students advancing at quicker paces. So getting a student to relax is probably the most important thing. And it's going to be different with, different students. You have to kind of learn your student, read your student, and try to find the things that will make them relax.
Yep. I wholeheartedly agree. This relaxing really changes how you touch the cyclic. It changes how you feel about entering an emergency procedure. It changes your confidence. It changes everything if you can just relax. It's such good advice. And for our listeners, that's coming from somebody that's done a lot of instruction, a lot of check rides. You got to follow that advice. Follow that advice. So you leave Fort Walters and go to Rucker. Now the airframe changes automatically. As soon as you get there, you change the airframes.
That's right. I believe, at Fort Rucker, we go through instrument training. Now, I did the instrument training in a TH-13, which is a Bell 47. but we didn't get instrument rated then. We got what the Army called a tactical instrument ticket. So it basically was enough instrument training the Army felt so that if you did get inadvertently in a IMC situation, hopefully you had some training to get out of it. But we didn't actually get an instrument rating. Wasn't it until I got back from Vietnam that the Army had now changed to where everybody had to have an instrument rating.
Wow,
So
that's interesting.
I think the TH-13 was the instrument trainer was the next stage. And then we went into the transition into the Huey. And then from the transition of the Huey to tactics.
Wow. So you said the Army felt that was enough. What does Tim Tucker think in hindsight? Was that enough, or should it have been more even back then, instrument training before you went downrange to Vietnam in a combat zone?
Well, we could talk for the rest of this podcast on helicopter instrument flying.
Oh, yeah.
My opinions on helicopter instrument flying. But I guess having said that, there's in the Vietnam situation, instrument currency and proficiency goes into the background. However, I did 5 or 6 months into my Vietnam flying have an inadvertent IMC situation, and I had to spend 20 minutes in the clouds, and I got out of it. So yeah. I guess the training was sufficient enough. I would have predicted it was, but at least in my case, it was.
I don't know a ton about the climate and terrain of Vietnam other than what I've seen on TV, but what I've seen, there is terrain and there's a lot of weather. I see a lot of the rainy season. It doesn't stop raining from what it seems. So I can imagine there's a lot of scenarios where you find yourself in a situation where that's a real threat.
Yeah, I was in the Central Highlands, and so it was quite mountainous. And you're right. During the dry season, it's nice every day, but during the rainy season, it rains every day.
Wow. Yeah, there's lots of weather during that season, and the war doesn't stop for weather. So, you're flying in some very interesting conditions, I'm sure. So how you end up in the Huey at Rucker? Anything about your initial training in the Huey? I mean, that's a big change from the other aircraft that you were flying. A really big change. What do you remember about that? The switch to the Huey?
Well, I guess the one thing that jumps out at me is that first time I sat in a Huey, and there were all these switches. How am I ever going to learn what all these switches do? Especially coming from the little TH-55, which probably had 5 switches on the whole cockpit. Yeah. So there are switches above you, below you. It was just overwhelmed with switches.
Yeah. But eventually that became second nature, and that became your home, that inside a Huey for quite a while.
Yeah. And of course the Huey, is just a lovely helicopter. It's big, it's heavy, forgiving. So going from that quick little TH-55 into the Huey was a dream.
Once you finished your training at Rucker, how long was it from graduation wings to going to Vietnam?
I had a 2-week leave, and so I went home for 2 weeks, and then reported to, I think I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey to catch an airplane to Vietnam. So I had 2 weeks off.
Did you already know what unit you were a part of before you got there, or did you just show up in Vietnam and then they tell you, hey, this is where you're going?
Yeah, you go to first what they call a replacement center. And so it all depends on what type of pilot you are: gunship pilot, utility pilot, cargo pilot, scout pilot, what type of pilot you are. But more importantly, where do they need pilots?
Yeah.
And so what type of pilots do they need? And then where do they need you? And so that was all determined once you got to Vietnam.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't until you were there. Now, you just mentioned the type of pilot you were. How was that determined? Was that determined at Fort Rucker, where they said you're going to be in a gunship, you're going to be in a slick, you're going to be medevac, that sort of thing? Or how did that work?
The way it worked is at the end of flight school, you got to choose if you wanted to go on and transition to either a scout helicopter, a gunship, or a Chinook cargo helicopter. I chose to stay with the Huey and didn't choose any of those, but you could have gone to fly Chinooks. But interestingly, when you got to Vietnam, that didn't mean anything. If you'd gone on after flight school to Chinook school, now you're Chinook qualified, you go to Vietnam, if they didn't need Chinook pilots, but they needed Huey pilots, then you flew Hueys.
Got it.
So when you got to Vietnam, it was pretty much strictly what was needed at the time.
Was there any additional training that went on in Vietnam before you went to your unit, or was that all you're assigned to the 57th Assault Helicopter Company and they're going to train you?
Yeah, well, first it kind of, the assignments kind of go bigger down to little. I was assigned first to the 1st Aviation Brigade, and then they looked at their units, and from there, I was assigned to the 52nd Helicopter Battalion. And then when I got there, they looked at their needs, and I was assigned to the 57th Assault Helicopter Company. So it kind of works on that reverse pyramid sort of.
Gotcha.
Sort of like. So I didn't know I was going to be in the 57th Assault Helicopter Company in Pleiku until probably I'd been in Vietnam probably 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay. And then you went to the 57th, and that's who you're with for your tour, period. You stay there, and
they have an orientation. It wasn't so much on learning to fly the helicopter. They assumed you knew that. It was more on, their method of doing things, their area of operations, that kind of thing. More of,
gotcha.
Of a local area kind of orientation.
Yeah. And the 57th AHC, which is the Gladiators, correct? The Gladiators.
All signed Gladiators.
Yeah. Tell us about the Gladiators. I mean, this particular helicopter unit in Vietnam had a very, very unique missions profile. And it's a fascinating profile, and it's a dangerous profile. And not that flying helicopters in Vietnam is dangerous, period, no matter what profile you're flying. But this one in particular really grabbed me. Tell us about the Gladiators and that mission profile.
Okay. Well, it takes quite a long explanation to really do it justice. So I'll preface this by saying that I do have an essay on this particular mission on my website that one could go to for more details. But basically what we did is we operated along the Laotian border, and we took small 4, 6, 8-man reconnaissance teams made up of the indigenous Montagnard people, along with 1 or 2 Army Special Forces guys, and inserted them along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos for various reasons. They would either just look for troop concentrations or count equipment, troops moving down the trail. Sometimes it would be a prisoner snatch to gain intelligence. Sometimes it would try to identify sites for future B-52 bombing raids. Number of different missions, but it was all inside of Laos, where we weren't supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so we would insert these teams and go back into South Vietnam and hold at a little tiny air base just inside the border, and we'd wait. And if the team got into trouble, we have to go get them. And that's when things would get interesting.
Yeah. Did the NVA, did they figure out what the Gladiators were doing after a period of time where it got more difficult for you to do that mission?
Well, I think they the bad guys more focused on the special forces guys and on trying to identify where and when they would be around. The helicopters pretty much just brought them. So we tried to insert the teams in areas or in places where the bad guys wouldn't know you had inserted them, which is a challenge because we had 6 Hueys and 4 Cobra gunships would be the team that would go in as part of the insertion. So it's hard to sneak up on somebody with 6 Hueys and 4 Cobras. So we'd have to be lots of times quite a ways from the actual objective that the special forces guys, the recon guys had. However, when they were discovered, and there's only, 4, 6, or 8 of them, and, you're not going to win the war with 8 people. So the recon team had to run and get extracted. And you pretty much had to get extracted where they were. They weren't able to move to an open area or a clear area. This is the jungle in the Central Highlands. There weren't a lot of clear areas. So we had to extract them right there at that point. And of course, the bad guys knew the helicopters would be coming and set up for that. So it was a contest really between, the Hueys, the Cobra gunships versus the bad guys.
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission-critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed-wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support.
I'll just go one little bit further into the way, as I said, many instances we couldn't land in the LZ. So we would come to a hover over the top of the jungle, which may be 150, 200 feet high. And we'd actually have to work our way, we called it a hover hole, down through the jungle. So you would have your door gunner and crew chief in the back saying, move the helicopter 10 feet to the left. You do come down 5 feet, bring the tail 4 feet to the right. And you just following their instructions, you would just kind of maneuver your way down through the jungle. In many instances, we'd have to chop a tree down or a branch down to clear being able to go down. We finally get within 100 feet of the ground, and we had these 4, we called them strings. They were ropes that came out of 2 out of either side of the helicopter that came down, and then there was a triangle with a bar across. And all of the recon team wore these rigs with a D-ring on their shoulder, and they would grab this bar and hook their D-ring onto the bar. And then once we had 4 guys hooked up, we would begin that same maneuvering back up through the jungle. Sometimes it would take us 15 or 20 minutes to get all the way to the top. And then we have to get 100 feet above the jungle so that the team was clear, and then we could take off. And so the whole time that's going on, bad guys are shooting, the Cobras are shooting, but we're kind of hidden in the jungle. I mean, you a lot of noise, but you really couldn't see too much, which worked well for us.
Wow. That's a very unique flying under dangerous circumstances for sure. One thing that I read, and I encourage people to go to your website. I'm going to talk about it at the end, but I'll say it right now. Tim Tucker's Helicopter World, timtuckershelicopterworld.com, and read this essay. That essay about the 57th AHC is absolutely amazing. You should write a book, Tim. I'm just telling you, because I wanted more, because it's so fascinating. One other part of the package that you took into this mission was fast movers. You took there were jets that were assigned to your package on some of these occasions. Is that correct?
Right. We either had Navy A7s or Air Force F4s, normally two of them. And they were on standby in case things got to be too much for the Cobras to handle. Then we would have we called them fast movers, prepare things a little bit for us.
How often did they get into the mix where they were dropping ordnance as part of this mission? Was that a regular occurrence?
Well, it wasn't every mission, but it wasn't unusual either. It was relatively common, but certainly not every single time.
Yeah.
And we never knew whether it was going to be the Air Force or the Navy that was going to be supporting us. That kind of went on. We worked with an Air Force forward air controller who was in a Cessna Skymaster. It was, Air Force called them O2s. Yep. And he was the forward air controller that would be the link between the Army helicopter assets and the Air Force or Navy fast movers.
So he's kind of like an air boss kind of situation where he's coordinating everything.
And he'd also coordinate with the team on the ground.
Oh.
So he was the main coordinator.
Wow. One other part of that mission was resupply to an outpost. Tell us about that radio communication outpost that you were supporting.
Well, it's interesting because up until about, I guess 8 or 9 years ago, this was all classified. And
yeah.
It wasn't until it was declassified. The place is called Leghorn, and it was a radio relay site that was used for the B-52 who were doing bombing of southern Laos. And they were a radio relay so that if the recon team on the ground needed any kind of air support, it would be relayed through this radio site. It was on a ridge line, probably, 8 to 10 miles inside of Laos. And I've got a picture of it in this essay, and it's, like I say, perched on this little ridge line that goes up probably 2,000 feet over the Atapo Valley. Again, it was interesting. We used to resupply it twice a week with bullets and beans, and I'd go home and read an issue of the New York Times that said we didn't have any ground troops in Laos. And as I say, I had just taken bullets and beans to ground troops in Laos that morning.
Yep. Wow. It's fascinating. And once again, I'll go back to the beginning, and Tim is a very humble man. I know that. I've known that for a long time, but I'll just say it one more time, because you did one tour in Vietnam with the 57th, correct?
Correct.
In that time, Silver Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Bronze Star, 28 Air Medals, 5 Certificates of Achievement, Senior and Master Aviator. My goodness, that shows the risk involved in what you were doing, and the skill that you needed to do it. It's absolutely incredible, and I'm really, I mean it. You should write a book, Tim, just on that.
Jack, it was really because of the mission of the unit, and all the pilots in that unit went through the same things, and they received awards too. It was really because of the uniqueness of the mission and everything. So it wasn't really just me; it was all the pilots of the 57th.
No doubt. No doubt. I understand that completely. The whole crew. Trusting your crew chief and your gunners with your life, going down into a jungle. Wow. It's amazing. We've had several Chinook pilots on that talk about their crews and how they would guide them. They trust them 100%. And they would guide them to put a one-wheel landing, on a rock to extract a SEAL team, or, the crew coordination is just fascinating. And the trust. Can you talk about that trust with your crew in the back?
Well, you kind of lived and worked together day in and day out. It's not like you had a job that you left and went back to your home or back to your family. You lived with these guys 24 hours a day. You go to the club together and eat together and drink together and play poker together. And so there's a bond that develops that, and then you add the combat environment, and that bond becomes even stronger. I mean, you'd be down at the bottom of one of these hover holes trying to maneuver your way around, and you have a discussion in the cockpit, is that tree too big for us to hit with the blades or not? And then one of your buddies who's up at 2,500 feet would say, come over the radio and say, Tim, if you don't make it out of there, can I have your stereo equipment? And here down at the bottom where the tension was, you could cut it with a knife, that would kind of just relax you. Your shoulders would slump down and you'd give a little grin, and it's just going to relieve the stress of the moment.
Yeah.
And that would happen all the time. Steve, what was your wife's telephone number? Kind of thing. If you don't get out of there, I want to know where your wife lives. Kind of thing. So it was, that kind of thing that helps quite a bit in these, tense. And I'm sure you've seen that a lot in police work too.
Yeah, but not quite to that extent. I mean, John, do you remember hovering and in the trees and getting shot at all the time out in Ontario? I know. Can you even imagine?
It's really interesting for me to hear you talk about this. And I think there's no doubt in my mind, and I think of most people's minds, your generation of piloting is regarded as the most talented generation of pilots that has ever existed in the helicopter world. And what you guys brought out of that, take you, for example, the instructing you did afterwards, you taught those lessons that you learned in Vietnam to people that are flying today. So it's really inspiring to hear these stories. I echo what Jack said about the book. I think it'd be really great to read more in depth about the things you're describing. Think of Hugh Mill's book, A Low Level Hell, and how inspiring it was to read that. So man, it would be really cool to see a book come out highlighting some of these things you're talking about. But just hearing you talk about it is really inspiring. And again, I'm honored to talk to you and sit here and hear firsthand these stories you're talking about. It's amazing.
Well, I've written a number of magazine articles and things. And I find writing extremely difficult. It's not something that comes easy to me. And sometimes I'll struggle over a sentence and rewrite a sentence 5 or 6 times. I mean, it doesn't come easy. So a book sounds kind of overwhelming.
I'm just being selfish. I just want a book. That's all.
The beauty of podcasts is our ability to come on and talk about these situations and stories that you're a part of in a natural, organic way. So I appreciate the fact that you want to join us and talk about that. That's really cool.
I thought of this when I was reading the essay, Tim, about the power management that you had to do when you had all those guys on the string, and that it would, you're really managing power at that point without a lot of maneuvering area. How did those lessons learned from your flying time in Vietnam, how did those benefit you down the road when you were in the other jobs that we're about to talk about, particularly with Robinson and working on power management and height velocity curves and all of that? How did that help you later on?
Well, I think that when it comes to power management, and especially when you're operating at the fringes of your power available, the key thing there is to do things very slowly. Because when you start doing things, making control inputs that are quick, they are apt to be large or too large. And that's where, when power is critical, you run into a problem. So I think that's why it would take us sometimes 10 or 15 minutes to hover out of the jungle, because it was done extremely slowly, because we had the problem not only with power, but with tail rotor control. And you had 4 human beings dangling 100 feet below you. So things just had to be slow. And that's key, I think, to power management and that type of thing. It's just being slow.
Yeah. It doesn't, I mean, that applies to pilots listening that are going to do a confined area. I mean, it may not be a jungle, it may not be RPGs and bullets flying, but power management is power management. It doesn't matter where that particular rotorcraft is. If you're in a confined area, that what you just said, being patient and doing it slow, that a big input can get you in trouble. That applies to every rotorcraft pilot that there is, no matter what the airframe.
I used to teach a mountain flying course in the Army, and we used to say on an approach in the mountains, you can't go too slow. Go too fast, but you can't. As long as you're moving forward, you can't go too slow.
Yeah, good advice. Now, there was one award that I was not familiar with, and I asked an Army friend about it, but I want you to talk about it. That it's listed as the U.S. Army Broken Wing Award. What is that, and how did you get that?
Okay, first of all, it's a safety award that comes from a totally different office in the Army, as opposed to a award for valor or award for service or something like this. This comes out of the Army Safety Center, and it's an award given to pilots who have an in-flight emergency and are able to land the helicopter without injuring either people or the aircraft.
Wow.
And I had an engine failure over downtown LA in the Army Reserves, and was able to land a little baseball field, left field, fair territory.
Wow.
The kind of the fun thing about that is we were coming back from our 2-week annual training. And so I was the first ship in a flight of 7. And typical of our Army radios, we have 3. We have a VHF, a UHF, and a Fox mic. But amongst the 7 helicopters, nobody had all 3 working. So to give any command to the flight, to change formation or whatever, I had to do it on all 3 radios in order to get it to everybody. So since I was the first one, when my engine quit and the aircraft just kind of falls out of the sky, I just made my radio call on the radio that my selector happened to have been on. So the first 2 helicopters behind me, they didn't hear that call, and they tried to follow me, and which obviously they're not going to be able to do. And finally, somebody else in the formation told the guys that, hey, his engine's quit, and they set up an orbit. And so as I'm coming down, I have an orbit of 6 Army Hueys. That's 12 of my peers watching this. And over the radio, I'd hear, "Don't screw it up, Tim," or something like that. So it was...
Wow. I'm really glad I asked you that. I did not know that, Tim. When did that happen? I'm sure you remember exactly when that happened.
That would have been in the late 70s.
Late 70s? Okay.
78, somewhere like that.
Yeah, because you continued your service with the Army. I mean, you came back from Vietnam and you continued as in the Army Reserve as a pilot for many, many years to come.
Yeah, and then I was actually a Department of Army civilian. So I was a civilian that worked for the Army full-time as an instructor during the week. Oh. And then on the weekends would take my civilian hat off, put my Army hat on, and fly the same helicopters with the same pilots, doing basically the same mission.
Wow. And how many years in the Army did you serve in the Army total?
27.
27. That's quite a career. So let's shift gears a little bit. And in 73, even though you were still in the Army Reserve, you're back from Vietnam, you got your CFI. You became a flight instructor. Where did you do that? And what airframe? Tell us about that event, because that became a pivotal event in your life for what would lie ahead?
Thanks to our sponsor, Airbus. Airbus provides the most efficient helicopter solutions to its customers who serve, protect, and save lives and safely carry passengers in demanding environments. Its civil and military helicopters are flying all over the world, making missions possible. Visit airbus.com for more information.
When I got out of the Army, I got back from Vietnam. I spent an extra year in the Army at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, got my instrument qualification. And then I got out of the Army, and I had made a promise to myself when I was in Vietnam that, Tim, if you make it out of this place, you're going to give yourself the same year that you spent here before you get serious about life. So when I got out of the Army, I bought a Volkswagen camper, brand new from the factory in Westphalia, Germany, and I spent the next year in Europe, North Africa, and Turkey.
Wow.
And I spent a year. I came back. I went back home to my home in Connecticut. And all right, now I got to get serious about life. I didn't want to go back to law school. I kind of had it with school and didn't want to go back to law school. So I used the GI Bill to get my instructor's certificate in a Bell 47 at Danbury Airport, Danbury, Connecticut. And then spent the rest of the summer teaching in that Bell 47. Problem is it happens every October, November in New England, and that is winter comes.
Yeah.
And I had not been in winter for the previous probably 4 years. And I had to go out and pre-flight that Bell 47 in the winter, and I wanted no part of the winter. So, so the Army had sent me to California for a 3-month thing when I was at Fort Campbell. And so I remembered that spot in California that I'd been to. So I'd had that camper shipped back from Germany. I loaded it up and drove to California.
Wow, that's great. That is great. Now, this is a big event, too, that we have to talk about for a few minutes, because this is really unique. I did not know this about you. I never heard this, and this just really hit me. In 1976, you put a $300 deposit down on something that would be a huge part of your life. Tell us about that $300 deposit. What did you do with that $300?
Well, I was working as an airplane flight instructor. When I came out from California, again, used the GI Bill, got all my airplane ratings, and was teaching airplanes. So I'm kind of a frustrated helicopter guy that's teaching airplanes. And the FAA changed the approved school training regulations, now FAR Part 141, which required a syllabus be written for approval. And in order to be a VA-approved school, you had to have 141 approval. So myself and 4 other guys started a little company where we wrote syllabuses for flight schools trying to get this 141 approval. And our claim to fame is we use an IBM System 3 computer, which at that time was probably the size of this desk here. And we put the basic syllabuses on this computer, which, were a whole new thing at the time. And that way we could tailor all the syllabuses to you in Portland or you in San Diego or you in Dallas. And so that was our kind of thing. And then I just happened to be reading the LA Times, and I saw a picture of this little tiny 2-place helicopter. And the story was about this guy that was living up on the hill in Palos Verdes, California, probably 20 minutes from Long Beach Airport. And he was designing and building this new personal helicopter. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. So I went to visit him. And long story short, we ended up putting a deposit down $300 deposit down on this very first R22. That was in 76. The R22 wasn't certified until March of 79. So I actually got involved with Robinson about 3 years before the R22 was actually certified. And then we didn't take delivery of that first helicopter until October of 79.
Wow. The very first Robinson R22 that made it out to the public was the one that you purchased. Serial number 3, right?
Serial number 3. Serial number 1 was the original R22. However, and it first flew in 1975. However, it crashed about midway through the FAA certification program, crashed in the ocean off of Torrance. The helicopter sank. Bob Golden, the test pilot, got out. So they built serial number 2, which was then used to complete the FAA certification program. And serial number 3, the one I purchased, was the one that was used to get, it's called a production certification. There's kind of 2 steps or 2 stages to this FAA approval process. First is getting the design approved, and that's the type certificate. But once you get the type certificate approved, you got to demonstrate to the FAA that you can build the helicopters to the same specification that the type certificate calls for. And that's called the production certification. Now, it's pretty easy for a company, say like Bell with a new helicopter, to demonstrate that, hey, we can build helicopters. But for a brand new helicopter like the Robinson, or a brand new helicopter company like the Robinson Helicopter Company, it actually took 6 months to go from the type certificate to the production certificate because of all the processes and tooling that Robinson had to get together and show the FAA that we can actually build these things like the blueprints call for.
And serial number 2 of the R22, where is that currently? That particular airframe at?
It's currently on display at the Smithsonian's Auxiliary Museum. I think it's at Dulles Airport.
Right, at Dulles. Yep, I've seen it.
I've not been there.
Oh, Tim, you have to go.
It's awesome.
You have to go. That place is incredible. You'll love it.
It's there along with the R-44 that flew around the world. However, it originally, Frank, after probably ship 3, 4, 5, and 6 were sold, Robinson needed money, so they took serial number 2, brought it up to production standards, and then sold it as a used helicopter because they needed the money.
Yeah.
So ship 2 was then out on the civilian market for probably, I'm going to say 10 or 15 years. Maybe not quite so long, but a good chunk of time being operated. I operated it for a few years. And then this is kind of a funny Frank Robinson story. Ship 2 came up for sale. It had reached its 2,000-hour overhaul. The owner didn't want to overhaul it, so he wanted to sell it. It was about the same time that Robinson was building their brand new building at Torrance Airport, mid-90s, 94, 95. So I went to Frank and I said, Frank, ship 2 is coming up for sale. Robinson ought to buy ship 2 and we could put it in the lobby of the new building and put a new paint job on it. And it would be kind of neat. And so Frank said, yeah, I kind of like that idea. So he contacted the new owner, and it turns out that the new owner wanted to sell the helicopter for $10,000 more than Robinson had originally sold it as a used helicopter some 10 years prior. And Frank said, there's no way I'm going to buy that helicopter for more than I sold it for. So he didn't buy it.
Wow.
But then a number of years later, he did buy it and donated it to the Smithsonian. And
that's really cool. That is a good story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one other first that you're involved in that I just learned about also is you were the first to endorse a student for solo in an R22. That's a big deal.
Well, we had the first one, and and started the training school. So it's not surprising that Pacific Wing and Rotor was the name of our school, and so it's not surprising that we had the first student to solo, the first student to get a certificate. Not really unusual. To put it in context, at that time, that would have been late 79, early 80. Typically, helicopter training in a Bell 47, a Hughes 300 would go from anywhere from maybe $130, $35 an hour up to $175 an hour. We started off with that first R22 at $45 an hour.
Wow.
So, I mean, we substantially cut the cost of what helicopter training was. And needless to say, we were mobbed. And so, as John, to go back to your comment very early on, I mean, this is what opened up this world of helicopter training to the civilian world. It now became affordable.
That really changed things there for sure. You going to talk to Frank Robinson that day, that little did you know that was going to be a huge part of your life going forward. I mean, you ended up working for Robinson for many, many years and in multiple different roles. Let's start with this. Tell us about your relationship with Frank Robinson. Did the two of you hit it off right away, and that's why this relationship went so well? How did that go? And then kind of lead into your different positions with Robinson.
Okay, well, it was it was a relationship that evolved over time. Kind of evolved along with the Robinson Helicopter Company as it grew and got bigger and started doing more things. It evolved from a maintenance standpoint. Initially, the factory did all the maintenance on the first few helicopters. So it wasn't a kind of thing where we hit it off. It was a relationship that, as I say, grew and evolved over time. We got this company that had bought this first R22. We did pretty well. We worked up to where we also had airplanes. We had, I think, 26 airplanes, and we had 10 helicopters, mostly R22s, but we also had a Jet Ranger and a Long Ranger, and we were doing quite well. And then, as you might expect, with a little bit of success, we had 4 partners, we started getting 4 different directions that people wanted to take the company. So long story short, we had a divorce. And so I sold my portion out and went to work for the U.S. Army as a Department of Army civilian, and then went to work for Robinson. And when I first went to work for Robinson really, and even through the years, was never big on titles or job functions or things like that. I mean, everybody did a little of everything. So I worked in experimental test flying, production test flying, marketing, writing training material, maneuvers guides, syllabus for training, things like that. As I say, everybody did a little bit of everything. And then in the fall of 1982, we had a bad accident here in Los Angeles. It was caused by low-G mass bumping. And it was that accident that convinced us that we had a real problem within the R22 instructor community. Let me take a moment and just to kind of explain the type of instructors we had in the R22 in those early days. They really fell into one of 2 camps. First of all, people like myself who had learned to fly in the military. And in the military, we flew big, heavier machines. And we got out of the military, and this was our first experience with a small, light, quick, low inertia little R22. And some of these instructors used to bigger machines had a difficult time moving to that light, quick, small helicopter. We also had at the time a lot of airplane schools or pilots that wanted to get into this world of helicopters. So they bought themselves an R22 dealership, got we called them demonstrators at the time. And then they take one of their airplane flight instructors. At the time, you only needed 25 hours to get a commercial helicopter license, assuming you had the airplane commercial. Another, 15, 20 hours to get a flight instructor certificate. And there you were at, 50, 60 hours total time in helicopters. And you were the helicopter guru for this brand new helicopter school. So those are kind of the two types of instructors that we had. So needless to say, we had a lot of accidents in the training room, a lot of them. And this final accident in the fall of 1992 convinced us that we had to do something for the flight instructors. So that's when we put together the Robinson Helicopter Company's flight instructor safety course. You had to be a flight instructor to get into it. It consisted of 3 days of ground training, 2.5 days of ground training, and then a flight portion. And it was geared specifically to flight instructors, common student errors, flight instructor techniques, things of that nature. And that went on for probably 10 or 15 years before the flight instruction accidents, the training accidents, went down tremendously. However, this coincided with a time where recreational accidents, remember now the helicopter is being sold to people for their own personal and private use, not just flight school. And we had a lot of recreational type of accidents. So we made the change to move from a flight instructor only safety course to a pilot safety course. Now, one interesting thing we did way back in the beginning with the safety course is to make it more attractive for flight instructors to come. We actually went to the FAA and got approval as a flight instructor refresher course. So we were the very first helicopter flight instructor refresher course to be approved by the FAA. Before HAI or VAI's now course, before the one that the police organizations now do. We're the very first ones. And then that approval lasted all the way till 2020 when I left. The new people decided not to continue it, which I was sorry for. But so we were at one point the first helicopter-only flight instructor refresher course approved by the FAA. And at one point, we were the longest running. Not the case anymore. Yeah.
When the instructional part, when you did that initially at 83 to 93, this is what I read, that it cut in instructional accidents by 68%.
Wow.
That's incredible. That's incredible.
Yeah, it was really needed. I mean, we had a lot of, as I say, instructional accidents that we were able to address fairly well.
Did you find that, I'm not asking for exact numbers or anything, but did you find when you opened it up to not just instructors, but pilots, was there also a reduction rate in accidents in Robinson aircraft that you could say, wow, we're getting through to them as well?
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Hangar Z podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories that promote the personnel and equipment behind the missions in public safety aviation. Lastly, stand by for a message after a word from our sponsors. Cheers.
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission-critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed-wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support. Thanks to our sponsor, Airbus. Airbus provides the most efficient helicopter solutions to its customers who serve, protect, and save lives and safely carry passengers in demanding environments. Its civil and military helicopters are flying all over the world, making missions possible. Visit airbus.com for more information.
When every second counts, trust Night Flight Concepts to keep you mission ready. With advanced night vision technology, FAA certified repair services, and expert training, we've got your six. Visit nightflightconcepts.com to learn more.
Thank you to our guest, Tim Tucker, for sharing his extraordinary 54-year journey in aviation with us. From his experiences flying the Huey helicopter in Vietnam to his vital contributions to flight instruction and safety innovations, Tim's stories and lessons remind us of the dedication and resilience that shape a successful pilot. We hope you gained valuable insights into the world of military aviation, the evolution of helicopter training, and essential safety practices that can enhance your flying experience. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and give it a share. Be sure to check out the Vertical Helicast's YouTube channel, as well as the Vertical Magazine YouTube channel, for incredible helicopter videos from around the world. Stay connected with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn for more episodes and updates. Until the next time, fly safe, and we'll catch you in the next episode of the Hangar Z podcast.